Hello friends, Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time, and I'm here to give you some tips on making the patchwork skirt. So I have a whole series out that I did several years ago on the patchwork skirts, but the thing is, part of the reason there's a series is that I kept modifying and changing how I did things to make the skirts better, and also came up with ways that you can tailor it to suit different sizes, even though it's pretty much a one size fits most. Some ladies need a bigger one, a shorter one, a longer one, or they want to make them for their children or grandchildren. And then I also came up with the pockets ideas, and how you place them is up to you. But what I'm going to do is link to the full series down below. But the main purpose of this is to not only cover some of those extra tips in there that people might be missing because they're not seeing the full playlist, they're only seeing the original video, but also to go over a few more things that I may not have added to those videos because I'm always coming up with new ideas. And I am making and selling these skirts again, but for those ladies who already sew them, because I can only make so many per week, if it's a good week, I might be able to get 2 done, but some weeks I might not be able to get any done. I'm so very busy, and there's a lot of people wanting these skirts. Anything I can do to help people to be able to make their own, and it should save you a little bit of money at least, then that's why I'm doing this. So right here I have an unfinished 3-tier skirt. So it's got threads and stuff hanging off of it. I wanted to use this as an example because I have the skirt all put together as far as all the tiers, but I haven't sewed up the sides. And so I wanted to be able to show you and give you an idea how I lay out my skirts, which is very different than how I did in that first video. So I'm going to give you an example. Now this is one of the earlier skirts I had made myself. And this was when I was still laying the skirts out the way I did in the original skirt making video, where I'd set the separate piles of colors. Like you see here, I have all these different colors broken up here for another skirt I'm going to be putting together. And I would lay them out in a certain order, and then I'd just grab the squares like this and pick it up that way. But the problem with doing it that way and always going with the same pattern every time is what you end up with when you're putting the skirt together is, and this one really, I didn't realize it until it was too late, but I had several places where the colors ended up overlapping 3 on 3 tiers. That one and the striped one both. I really didn't like that it did that. And like I said, I already had the skirt pretty much all put together before I realized it. And I was so disappointed. So it was because of that I came up with a new way to lay out the skirts. So the way I lay the skirts out now is very different. That way there, the first way actually takes up less space because you can just keep picking it up. The way I do it now requires a lot more space. And I used to do it in this room here because we used to have a lot more room, but now it's all filled up with tables and pool tables and ping pong tables and so on, because it's no longer a dance and martial arts studio. And so I used to be able to use this whole space and lay the whole skirt out. But what I do now is I'll lay out the top tier. I decide which color, which pattern, which print I want where. I use all 10-inch squares, and then the top tier is 6, and each following tier after that is going to double. So 6 squares for the top tier. So I'll space out the 6 squares way out along the floor. I usually use an arc pattern because that helps keep it a little bit closer together. And so that's what I have here, are those 6 squares. And then under that row, I'll start laying out the next tier, which is going to be 2 squares per each one of these. And then I can eyeball it as I go and change the squares up so that I don't have anything that ends up overlapping. And if I can help it, I sometimes miss this. Unless I do it by accident, I try not to have another one of these right here. Even though it's not overlapping, I still try to keep them spread out as possible so that it just looks nicer, and it makes everything mix up a lot better that way. Because of space, when I get to the 3rd tier, I can't lay the squares flat. So I'll show you a video clip here where I was in the living room working on laying out this particular one here. And so you can see the top tier, I kept kind of accidentally cutting it out of the clip, but the top tier, those 6 pieces are very well spread out. The second tier, they're flat and right next to each other, 2 under each one. So that's the second tier. And then the third tier, I bunched them up, and then again, 2 squares for each one. So you got the first tier is 6 squares, second tier is 12 squares, third tier is 24 squares. So that was all I had to do for this because it's only a 3-tier skirt in the first place. But when I go to do the 4th tier, and I do have a video on this, it's in that playlist. The first thing I do is, you can see here, this is going to be a 4-tier skirt, but I only have the 3 tiers laid out right now, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to first sew together the first tier, then I'm going to sew together the second tier where I have the pockets, and then I'm going to sew that tier onto the first tier. Then I'm going to sew together the third tier, but I'm not going to sew it onto the second tier because I want it to lay as flat as possible. And then what I'll do is once I get that third tier all put together, I'll lay it out in a big, huge arc in my living room. And then I'll, just like I did with the third tier, I'll lay 2 squares for each 1 square. So I'll end up with another 48 squares. That's the best way I can do it to make the most of my space. Now you can do, if you have a big enough space like I used to be able to do in here, you can lay out a whole 4-tier skirt that same way without having to do it the way I'm doing it, where I got to put it, you know, the first 3 tiers together before I can lay out the 4th tier. Let's just go back to the first 3 tiers, or if it's just a 3-tier skirt. The first thing I do is I pick up the bottom tier one by one. I start from the right hand side and work back to the left hand side, laying each piece down and the next piece on top of it flat. Once I have that whole tier all stacked, I clip it together with a clothespin so I know that's a full tier right there. Then I'll do the second tier the same way, including the pockets. This is a pocket right here, and you'll see a pocket on this side, and in the middle are the 2 pieces for the other pocket. And then lay that on top of there after I clip it together. Then same thing with the top tier, the 6. And then I'll do the same thing when I go to lay out the 4th tier, and then I gather it up from right to left, laying each piece on top of the other, and then clip it all together. And then I keep everything together that way. Now, when I go to sew it together, I'll unclip that, just the 1 tier at a time, and then I'll put that, this is especially important on the first tier, I'll put that clip on the end like that. And then I'll sew all my pieces on, obviously right sides together in this case. And then I'll leave that clip on there. And the reason I do that is so that when I go to pick it up to sew on the second tier, which I do the same thing too, I put that clip on the end of the first piece I've got. And then that way when I go to sew on the second tier, I know I'm putting it on the right way. So it's most important you keep that clip on for that first tier, so you know which way it goes on. Otherwise, you might still end up with your fabrics overlapping each other if you put it on backwards. Now, what I did do, as you might have noticed on this skirt, is to help break up that overlap. So this is just an option and something I know I haven't mentioned in other videos. Right here, you can see where I've got the 3 striped ones. I put a few patches along there to help break that up so it doesn't look so overlapped. And I did that in all places that were like that. And then just added a few more patches around the skirt to tie it all together. And I liked that. It did really help. So that is an option if you already have your skirt all put together and you want a way to kind of break it up once you realize, wow, those colors all lined up and I wanted them more spread out. Just sew some matching patches here and there and just break it up. Just sew them right on top. And I don't do anything special with the edges. I let them fray because I do kind of like that more ragged look to it. Now that brings me to the next one that I know I haven't talked about, is making the rag style skirt. So you can see, I'm going to put a couple images here of what the rag style skirts look like. And the difference is with the rag style skirts is all the main seams are on the outside. I still hem it on the inside, same thing with the waistband, but all those seams where the squares come together are on the outside. Now these ones, though they are a nice, fun, rustic look, they are more work. So once you get, let's say I'm gonna make this a rag style skirt, once you get all your pieces laid out, you're gonna work it actually opposite. So let's say I still am gonna put my clip here, but when I go to put my next piece on, instead of laying it right sides together like this, I'm going to do wrong sides together this way and stitch it like that, open it up, take that next piece and put it behind this one so wrong sides are together. So you're doing things very opposite. And then of course, when I go to sew it together, usually my clothespins are on the opposite end from when I first start sewing. I don't know if this is going to make sense, but when I go to do the rag style skirts, I flip it and so that the ends with the clips are on the end I start with. Otherwise, it'll get confusing if you don't do that. And I actually did a video where I showed little clips of putting together a rag style quilt for my grandson, my oldest grandson. But let's say these two pieces here are stitched together on these sides here. What you're going to do is very carefully, this is necessary for it to look right. Put little short snips all along there, and it is best to actually do it after you stitch it together than before. But the problem with doing it after is you got to be careful you don't get too close and snip your threading where you have it stitched together. But that is an important step. They're just very short little clips. And what that will do is when you go to wash it, it's going to give it just a better look all the way around. And it also helps prevent all those really long threads that want to come off. It just makes them short. But in this case, I do run it through the washing machine when it's done and then through the dryer to pull out a lot of those little short threadings that are going to come off. And then you're going to need to shake it really well. So then I just do the whole skirt that way. And that's why that particular skirt is more work, is because you got to do that everywhere on every single seam. So as I'm sewing the tiers together, I'll do that each time I stitch it together. Then when I sew one tier onto the next, then I'll go across that whole tier, and you want to do that before you stitch up the sides of your skirt. It's going to be much easier because you'll know right where you start, right where you finish, and you can stretch it out better. Then I'll do the next tier, do the same thing. Once I get it sewn on there, do that one, and then the last one. It is the very best way to do it when you're doing a rag style skirt. And then some other tips on that, especially with the rag style skirt, is consider adding some patches to the top of those, because a lot of those I like to do, usually like lately I've been doing a lot of these half denim and half other fabrics, other cotton fabrics. So you're getting the denim in the skirt without so much of the weight, but you're also getting these other colors and prints to really break it up. A fun touch, especially since it is a rag style and they are denim in there, is to add some kind of patch of some kind. I usually like to make a little heart-shaped patch just to kind of break it up. You could do squares like I did on this other one, or triangles or whatever, and just sew those on there. Some other options, like I do with the skirt that I made for Stacy from Off Grid with Doug and Stacy, you might have seen her wearing this long denim patchwork skirt. So one of the things I did for fun was took some different pockets from old jeans, whether they be patch pockets or flat pockets, and sewed them here and there on the skirt for both looks, but also for use. So not only does she have the hidden pockets on the sides of the skirts that I always set low down on the hips. It can make it harder to reach into them, but I like it better than on the second tier than on the first tier, because the first tier adds a lot of bulk to your hips to have those pockets in there. And I like the pockets to be a good size. In fact, I can show you right here. This is the inside of the skirt. Here's one of the pockets. It's a nice, good size pocket, but it's also hidden because I make it out of the same colors as the square it's being sewn onto. But I do cover that in the video on how I did that, in the video that's in the series where I talk about making the pockets and how to put them in there. And so, yeah, just consider adding some patches just for fun, whatever you want. Some old recycled jeans are great. That's where I get anything I use for the patches is old recycled jeans. Typically, I'll buy fabric, though, for the denim skirt, so I can go for the lightest weight possible fabric I can find that's denim. And you can find some really lightweight ones, but most of the jeans that you wear are a heavier weight jean, and it can make a very heavy skirt. You can do it, but I would recommend going with little narrow rectangles. You're not going to get the fullness as you would in these other styles with the 10-inch squares, but you can still have a nice, pretty full skirt with maybe a 7 or 8 inch wide rectangle, but still have it be 10 inches long. Or smaller if you need to make it shorter and you still want a 4-tier skirt. And for those who ask, I am only 5 foot tall, yet I always wear the 4-tier skirt. I prefer it. I like it when the skirt goes clear down to my feet. I learn how to work around it when I wear it. And I wear skirts all the time, all day long, no matter what it is I'm doing. It doesn't matter if I'm in the chicken coop or in the garden, working around the house, climbing ladders and picking stuff. I'm always wearing skirts. And I do go over how I function with that, how I made it work. It's just like anything else. You learn how to work around it, and then you come to find out you love it and it has its benefits. Not everyone will, but for me, I do. I love it. So I'll link to that video down below. I think I did it a year ago. And just real quickly, one way, at least for adults, that you can easily adjust the size, especially if you want the 4-tier skirt, but the approximate 34-inch finished length is just a little too long. Just cut a little more off the top. That's going to be the easiest way to do it, is make the top a little bit shorter. And then if you're wanting to add length, the same way. It's a lot easier to add length to the top than it is to the bottom. And that can be simply by taking those 6 squares that you're using across the top and making them 11 by 10 or 12 by 10, so you can add 1 to 2 inches that way. And if you still want it longer, then you can consider making the squares for the bottom tier rectangles the same way. I had to do that for a lady one time, and it did take a lot more fabric doing that because of the 48 squares at the bottom, which ended up being, of course, rectangles. But it was the best way visually to make the skirt as long as she needed it, because she's very tall. So it ended up being about a 38-inch long skirt by the time it was finished. In that video where I talk about customizing sizes, go over some ways that you can make it for children and grandchildren, the size squares you might want to use or the amount of squares you want to use. And before I continue on to the next topic, the next thing I want to talk about, if you're very thin and you decide 6 squares across is just too much, you've got a couple of options. If it's just too full and too heavy, you can do the same idea and make maybe 9 by 10 inch rectangles or 8 by 10 inch rectangles. You can also take a whole square out and make it 5, 10, 20, and then 40. It's obviously not going to be as full, but it might be easier if you have real narrow hips to be able to keep that up. The other thing is that you got to keep in mind is if you're going to bring it down to only 5 squares and you want to put the pockets in, you're going to have a harder time putting those hidden pockets along the seam and have them, they're not going to end up even. They're not going to be straight across from each other as you would if you have an even number of 6 and then 12. That's something you got to think about and really map that out and think about it before you do it. If it's important to have the skirt be narrower and important to have pockets, I suggest going with like an 8 by 10 rectangle rather than a 10 by 10 square. So then the other one that I know I haven't talked about yet is how do you do when you're doing the solid 3-tier top and then the patchwork on the bottom, as you can see in a couple of these images here, it's different in the way it goes together. The first 3 tiers are going to go together a lot faster because you don't have to, obviously you're just sewing the long strips together, as you would see in the very first skirt video I did, which is one of my very first videos where I found a full-size brown sheet for 50 cents at a garage sale and made a 4-tiered skirt out of it. Because you're just using these long strips, you don't have as much sewing to do, and you don't have to bunch it as much as you do when you're working with the 10-inch squares. You really got to bunch it so that the 2 squares on the next tier will fit on the single square on the tier just above it, where you can spread out your gatherings a lot more if you want when you're talking about a solid top with patchwork bottom. But what that's going to mean is that's going to mean you might not want or need 48 squares for the patchwork bottom, because that might be too much. You can, but it's going to ruffle out a lot more. For my work skirts, I always have just either a solid top, a fully solid skirt, or a solid top with a patchwork bottom like the one I'm wearing here. And so what you want to do is, I found the best number to work with when I'm doing that for the bottom tier is 40 squares. I've done others, but I find 40 easier to work with when it comes to that, because I can easily break that up into 4 parts, and then I can line it up better on the skirt itself. Let's say this is the solid top and that this is the 4th tier, and I go to gather it. My clothespins are going to come back into play. The very first thing I do is I find the very center of that 3rd tier by folding the skirt over and bringing it out, and I clip the center point. And then I'm going to clip the center point of that 4th tier, which will be 20 squares in, to that center point on the skirt body. And then I'll break that first part of 20 squares into 4 sections of 5, and then do that same thing. Keep finding that center by folding over and then clipping and clipping and clipping and clipping. That will help keep you, because you don't have the squares on the previous tiers to follow as a guideline. By doing that, by clipping it or pinning it, I like to use the clothespins best. I don't have to deal with pins poking me. And the clothespins are easier to find and move around as needed. And then I just gather as I go. And you can break that up smaller than that if you prefer, but that's why I like the 40, because it's so much easier to count out the 5 and 10 and 20 when I'm going that way. And I don't know if any of that makes sense, and maybe one of these days I should do a separate video just on that, but you can find ways that makes it work best for you. And again, you can use less or more squares at the bottom, but to make it the easiest for laying out and fitting onto that next tier of the solid part of the skirt, I find 40 works really well. And that's what's on the skirt that I'm wearing right here, is there's 40 squares all the way around. And you'll notice it's actually the same fabric I have right here. And then one more thing I wanted to add is that you can, if you prefer, I put a drawstring waist in all my skirts, and the drawstring is a combination of 2 pieces of crocheted 3-strand yarn that I then stitch together onto a short elastic band. And what that does is that adds a little bit of flexibility to the back, so when you're bending and moving and you've got that thing cinched up pretty tight, it can at least still move with you. And it also makes it more easily adjustable and comfortable. But if you don't like that, you can, which is what I initially did with this skirt, you can make a stretchy band for the top, which is the same that I do for the pants that I make to wear under my skirts for added warmth and modesty. Is I just take old sweatpants, take that elastic top off, and then put a wide elastic band, a wide stretchy band at the top, so that it doesn't add bulk around the waist and it's more comfortable that way. So anyway, I hope that covered all the things I meant to cover. And if you have any questions, put them down below. But remember, I go over a lot of this in that playlist that I'll be linking to in the description box down below, so you can check that out. I hope this gives some people motivation so they can make their own if they can't afford to buy one or are afraid they'll never get one, because there's so many people grabbing these skirts that I can't keep up on it all. Then I hope this helps. All right, well, thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.